Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Caffe Lena. Thank you for joining us for this storytellers evening. It is, might be the 5th Tuesday of the month this month, isn't it? That is very strange. So typically, our storytelling night is on the 4th Tuesday of the month. It is an ongoing series before all of our pandemic procedures were put in place. We were doing this as an open mic where there was one featured storyteller and people from the community could come and share their own stories in shorter segments. When we started going to live streams with restricted capacity, we moved to a system where we had 3 featured storytellers who each had a half an hour slot. And for the time being, we are sticking with that format. So that is what you are going to see tonight. If you are in the room here, you will see it in person. If you are online, you will have a front row seat. And hello to, if you've just arrived, I will be out there in just 1 second to check you in. I'm sorry, I'm pulling double duty tonight. So tonight we have 3 of our 3 illustrious organizers of this series sharing their stories tonight. We have Jeannine Laverty, Margaret French, and Christie Keegan. And Janine is going to be up first. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Janine to the stage and thanking her and all of them as they come up for all of the work that they put into this lovely series. So Jeannine Laverty, everybody.
Well, and those thanks go right back. Reese, when you get a moment, will you let me be able to see a little bit of the audience as we usually like to do? Storytellers are sort of picky that way. So I wanted to start by giving the thank yous right back to Sarah, who has helped us figure out how to do this, to Reese, who has done it for us every month and does marvelous camera work, and to Joe, ever faithful Joe, who told me tonight that my shoes were size 12. I would think Joe was sick if he said something nice to me, so it would be very awkward. Well, so it's very nice to be here with Christie and Margaret. I'm going to tell mostly, well, I'm going to tell from the work of Jean Robert Foster tonight. I don't tell very many personal stories, as seems to be the vogue these days, but I want to assure all listeners and that whenever a storyteller picks a story that is not from her own life, she's picking it because it has pulled her something from her life. And sometimes we know that when we choose a story, and then when we start to work on the story, we find out even more. And the stories that I'm going to tell you tonight are stories I've been telling for the most part for a long time. But today and this week, as I was working on them, they showed new things to me, as stories always do when we give them an opportunity. So I should tell you a tiny bit about Jean Robert Foster, not too much, because I tend to talk too much about her when I start telling you about her. But she was born in 1879 and lived until 1970. So she lived really the bridge between the time in our country that when it was mostly rural and when it became industrial, except that the people in the Adirondacks didn't necessarily make that transition. But she, like any number of Adirondack girls, married a New York man, actually a Rochester man, she married at 17, and he was 25 years older than she, Matlock Foster. And this was fairly common for fairly well-off men who came to the Adirondacks to hunt and fish. And there are a number of them who found young women in the Adirondacks that they recognized had qualities that might go undeveloped if they stayed in the country. And so during Jean Robert Foster's lifetime, she had been already teaching school at the age of 15 because her family itself was one of those funny combinations. Her dad was a logger. He did odd jobs wherever he could find, so the family moved around a lot. Her mother, on the other hand, had been educated and was a teacher. But the family was so poor, as was the case with many of the people living that hard life, that Jean didn't always grow up living with her family. Sometimes she was farmed out to neighbors or other relatives because they didn't have enough money to feed all of the children. There were only 3 of them. So she wrote letters. She started writing pretty young. She wrote letters when she was 8 and not living with her family. She wrote a lot of letters home explaining her situation, talking about what she saw and the people that she observed. Then at 15, she was teaching school. Then at 17, she married Matlock Foster. She got educated in Rochester. Then they moved to Boston. She took extension courses at Harvard from William James, from the philosopher also Santayana. Then World War II happened and Prohibition, World War I happened and Prohibition, and that's when the expatriate writers left this country and went to Paris. Jean Robert Foster, as a journalist and as a model and as a writer of artistic copy, went also to Paris. So her life was a pretty remarkable one. But the writing that remains and what really stayed in her heart were those people that she started writing about at age 8. And she eventually became known as the voice of the Adirondack Mountains. So I'm going to tell you 4 of her stories tonight, and I'd like to just tell them without, should you feel inclined to put your hands together, without doing that, because I'd like the pictures, the portraits. The book is actually called Adirondack Portraits, and they are small portraits of people that were in her life. Probably there are other things I wanted to say to you, but you're wanting me to stop and start telling the stories, aren't you? Me too. Well, I will tell you that I grew up in Iowa, not at all in the mountains. So when I tell these stories, I'm not an Adirondack storyteller. I am telling stories of the Adirondacks. And the Flatlanders, my family was also Irish Protestant, so I recognize the people in her stories. And this is the first one of Jean Robert Foster's stories that I learned because the man in it reminded me so much of my grandfather and my great uncle. My grandfather and grandmother lived down the road and up a square corner. You know, everything was square laid out in Iowa. And my great uncle lived straight across the field. So often I would hear my great uncle and my grandfather and my dad out in the driveway yelling and swearing and talking about things. I loved hearing the swearing. This is old Man Wamsley. If he had a first name, I never knew what it was. He had come to the Adirondacks in my grandfather's time, the time of famine in Ireland. And the Wamsleys had settled on those steep, rocky, thin-soiled hills that looked up towards Marcy and Whiteface. And like the other Ulster Protestants who settled around them, they were happy just to have the land that was theirs. Now, old Man Wamsley was severe, stiff, unbending, savage of temper. He ignored his two daughters until they left home and idolized his son Wooly, who spent winters in the lumber camps and saved all his pay to bring home to his father. The house that the Wamsleys lived in looked probably a lot like their house had looked in Ireland. There was a sheet iron stove, there were a few wooden chairs, there were no carpets or rugs on the floor, and certainly there were no curtains. There was a time when the neighborhood women came round. This was a while before Mrs. Wamsley just faded away from her hard life. The neighborhood women wanted to put up curtains in the house. But old Man Wamsley wouldn't let him. He said, "I don't want any curtains to block out my light. I want to look out on what's around." So the neighbor women went away, and they didn't come back. Now, not enough money for furniture in the house, but plenty of money to build a tall wooden fence around the orchard. Now, mostly we shared work and fruit in the settlement, but old Man Wamsley didn't share. And he had the finest seckel pear tree. It rose above the top of the fence. I could see it. I could see when those sweet little green-brown pears with their rosy cheeks, I could see as they swelled up. And when the fall came, I would go find an empty lard bucket, and I would start to walk up the steep hill that separated our place from the Wamsleys. Now, before I got all the way up to the orchard gate, old Man Wamsley would be coming down from his house. I guess he'd been able to see me through those windows with no curtains. And he would be roaring about things he didn't like, children, dogs, other things. And by the time I arrived at the gate, I would always feel that I should just turn around and go home. But I would stand there gazing at the seckel pears, and he would open up the gate, take out of my hand that lard pail, fill it with those sweet, juicy seckel pears, hand it back to me, push me out, and latch the gate. I remember another time when it wasn't a gate, but it was a door that was latched behind me. There was a winter that my father was in the lumber camps as usual, but for a reason I no longer remember, Wooly was home with his father. And a terrible and quick storm came up. And there was my mother with me at 5, a 3-year-old and a baby, and she knew that she had to save our stock. And she also knew that she couldn't leave 3 little girls inside while she tried to find and close up the animals. So she bundled me up. She bundled me up from head to toe as best she could. And then she said to me, "You must get through." And then she opened the door to our house and she pushed me outside. And when she closed the door, I heard the latch and I heard that little switch that you push from the inside so that no one from outside can get in. The wind blew the snow and it cut my cheeks. But I started up the hill to the Wamsleys. And when I came to the line fence, the fence that separated our property, that made the line, our property and the Wamsleys, I was already so sleepy from the cold that I wanted to lie down right there in the fence line. But even at 5, I had already been taught that if I did that, I would never get up. So I crawled under the fence and then crawled the rest of the way up the hill to the Wamsleys, pulled myself up onto the porch and pounded on the bottom of the door. It was old Man Wamsley who opened up the door. The sound of his voice that day I had never heard before, and I never heard again. Wooly, Wooly, the child, out in all this storm. And he pulled me in, latched that door, set me between him and the sheet iron stove and began to brush and rub off the snow that had made ice and then accumulated all over me, began to rub my arms and my legs. And when I began to shiver, and then when I began to stop shivering, he said, "Child, what happens at your house?" I told him that my father was in the lumber camps and my mother needed help with the animals. "We can't lose any of them, old Man Wamsley," I said. He said, Wooly, it's not a fit night out for man nor beast, even for a big man like you. But you take this child home pick-a-back, and you do whatever needs doing for her mother." So I had hardly gotten warm, and my clothes had hardly gotten warm when they were back on me, all wrapped round, and this time it was old Man Wamsley pulling my scarf tight. And then up I went on Wooly's shoulders. And out we went into that storm, and the wind cut my cheeks. Oh, yes, it did. But this time, I was warm. I was warm with the pride I had not failed my mother. I was heading back down the hill, carried on Wooly's shoulders. That's old Man Wamsley. So I I decided to tell these stories chronologically, the way she wrote them tonight, which I don't always do, but that's what I'm going to do. And this story, I guess one thing I wanted to say in the beginning was that even though these stories are 100 years old, or when people tell folk tales or mythology that are centuries old, they all have things to speak to us right now. And I know that we all came tonight with pictures of things going on in our world that give us sorrow. And those pictures were in my mind as I was thinking about these stories tonight. So, okay, this one is called Blue Calico, the Ingrate. Esther Mead always wore blue calico. It was the dark blue, cheapest kind of calico that had white vining flowers all over it. People liked it to make squares in bed quilts sometimes because it didn't fade. But Esther Mead wore it. She wore it in summer and in winter because she didn't have anything else to wear. Oh, she did have, there was a church member who gave her an old gray alpaca dress that she could wear for special Sundays for church. But Esther Mead, she was a frail old maid. That's a word we don't use much anymore, isn't it? She was a frail old maid. And it seemed like there were tears in her eyes, even when she was smiling with her lips. She had taken care of her parents until they had both died. And by the time all the bills were paid, there was nothing left. And Esther Mead was already too old to be hired out to work. So the church members took turns boarding her. This season here, that season there, this season here, to keep her away from the county house. I remember one early January, I was putting away the Christmas things, and my neighbor came bursting in the door. She was excited, and her eyes were snapping. She said, "I want to tell you about Esther Mead. She has turned out to be an ingrate. After all these years that us church members have taken her in, I mean, she goes from one place to another. It's been 10 years now, and we ask nothing of her except, to help with the starched ironing and the washing and the mending, and in the fall, the pickling and the canning. When she comes to my house, I have her seam the pillow slips and the sheets, and some plain sewing. But what's that? Nothing. Nothing for food and her room and board. But just today, here's what she said to me. I don't want this blue calico anymore. I want you to take it back to Cyrus Brown, the storekeeper. I know he's been putting it on the tree for me every year for 10 years. It's the only thing I ever get on the tree. Except this year. This year, there was a little box on the tree for me covered with ribbons. In bows, those ribbons. And inside was a bottle of perfume. I heard that maybe it was the new school teacher who put it on the tree. When I opened up the perfume, it smelled like musk roses. And then I remembered that we had musk roses growing by our cellar dooryard when I was a little girl. And I had a dress once that was silk and smooth and just the color pink of those musk roses. I don't want this calico. Take it back. You know, when she did that, my neighbor said, I remember that I don't think she even thanked me when I gave her my old gray alpaca, so she would have something special to wear on Sundays. Well, I took that calico, and I took it to Cyrus Brown, and I put it down on the counter. And I said, she's turned out to be an ingrate. He said, is she still in her right mind? When I told him about the bottle of perfume, he said, now what would Esther Mead want with a scent bottle? I don't keep any of that stuff in my store. I'll say you're right. She is ungrateful. Frankly, I was always glad that I could see my way clear to put 10 yards of that fine calico on the tree for her for 10 years. You know what she was doing when I left the house to come over here to you? You'd think she would have been up, getting at the starched ironing. No. She was sitting by the sink doing nothing. There were tears rolling down her cheeks. And she smelled of that perfume. The ingrate, blue calico. Well, I'm hoping that there might be some friends that I used to spend time with at Big Bend National Park, watching from a distance. But even if they're not here, the woman who witnessed the reason that my Big Bend friends call me Blade Runner, that woman is here. There was a time when I was telling a story that had a scythe in it. And I brought the scythe that was in my garage. And I brought it up onto the stage. And because it was the old layout of the cafe and holding it here, some of the people around the corner couldn't see it. I turned it a little bit. And because I had never handled this scythe, I didn't realize how long the blade was. And when I turned it and then went to put it back, I cut my finger on the scythe. And Kay Olin, who's sitting right back there, rushed forward with a Band-Aid. which I refused because I always carry my father's handkerchief in my pocket. So here's a story, the kind I told you I was never going to tell. Anyway, this story is the favorite of my Big Bend friends because we used to work kind of hard when we were down there. Some people have strange things rattling around in their heads, tucked around in the corners. Now you take Milo Brown. He has something that I wish I'd asked him more about when he was still here on this earth. Oh, he had a name for it. He called it Second Wind. But there was more to it than the name. I found out about it one fall when Milo came to me for work. Now, mostly we traded work in the settlement, but Milo didn't own his farm or even his house. And he had a wife and a pack of hungry children. And he wanted work. He wanted to be paid. Well, Milo was little and lean and scrawny, and I said, Milo, I'm not sure you can keep your end up. Swinging a scythe all day long in the hayfield? Well, Milo said he could, so I let him start work. And he did hold his end up pretty well until about 10 o'clock. We were mowing in the North Meadow where the timothy grows straight and tough and tall. But I saw Milo sink down on a stone. Now, we all took a break then. My wife had sent some switchel out to the hayfield, and we all had a drink. That's the early version of Gatorade. It was made from, this is Jean Robert Foster doesn't explain this, but I think I will. It was made from water and vinegar, because they had apples, and honey or maple syrup. And you could make it however you liked it, sour or sweet, but it replaced what was lost when you were sweating so hard when you were working. So, while everyone was having some switchel, I walked over to Milo and I said, "Is it too tough for you, Milo?" Milo did some sweat mopping. And then he said, "It's tough, but I won't notice it once I get my second wind." "Oh," I said, "Milo, I've heard say of your second wind. Does it always come on time?" "It comes," said Milo, "when I need it. The Lord made me little and scrawny, but he gave me something else. I find that when I've worked as hard as I can, then there's something else that happens in me. It's like a strong man was inside there, just saying, 'Milo, just keep on trying.' I've tried. My second wind never failed." Milo stood up then and he began to sharpen his scythe. I've always loved to hear that sound of whetstones ringing out in the hayfield. When we started in to mow again, Milo quickly pulled out ahead of all the rest. He was heading up to the top of that meadow, laying a long, smooth swath, even and straight. And when we went back down for supper that night, Milo wasn't nearly as bushed as all the rest of us. I always wish I'd asked him to tell me more about that second wind of his, 'cause I sure could use it every now and again. That's second wind. Oh, wow. I've talked way too long. We're all going to be talking way too long tonight. Yeah. Well, maybe I'll stop, because now you all have a second wind. So, yes, go ahead. Thank you. So you can hear State Land another time. But now you're going to hear Margaret French. I'd like to say something smart alecky, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to get off the stage. Come on, Mark.
Thank you, Joe. We all have our very own microphones. It's so cool. I feel I've arrived somehow. And I can't tell you how nice it is to have this sea of faces. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the Caffè Lena people who make this possible. Remember Lady Chatterley's Lover? No, it was banned. It was banned in the United States. It was banned in Great Britain. It was, of course, banned in Canada, where I lived. And 1959, the Supreme Court decided that it had some kind of social or literary value, and the ban was lifted. And in 1960, Penguin Books in Great Britain, they had been sued, and they won the lawsuit, and 200,000 copies, every single first edition they had, was sold out the same day. Right? And the ban was even lifted in Canada. Right? So I knew when I went to college in the 60s, and I knew that one day I was going to read all of D.H. Lawrence novels because I believed in freedom of the press. Right? And they're still on my list one of these fine days. You know? Well, went to McGill in the 60s, and we had this massive scandal. I lived in the Royal Victoria College, which had been the women's college when McGill had been just for men. And by the time I got there, it was the women's residence. And because it had once been the college, it had great facilities. It had its own little library. And I worked in that library. So the scandal was that the prissy librarian in Royal Victoria College had cut out all the good pages of Lady Chatterley's Lover. And, we were shocked. I mean, here we were mature adults. Some of us were even old enough to vote or drink. And that woman chose to take out those with scissors. Well, it was quite the talk of the campus for a fair bit. Now, working in the library, I always liked libraries. They're good places to work. And And since it was in the building where I lived, I never had to go outdoors to go to work. In Montreal in the wintertime, that's a very good thing. So I was shelving brand new books, and I usually kind of glanced at them before I put them away to see what they were about. And this brown book came in. I generally don't like boring, dull, brown-looking books. And this one had a title that I had my doubts about. It looked like it was going to be one of those philosophical, meditative, spiritual Eastern religions kind of book. I was pretty sure I wasn't going to like it. But I opened it up. It was the Kama Sutra. Well, at the time, I was as pure as the driven snow. And I hadn't realized that bodies did those kind of things, that bodies were capable of doing those kinds of things. So I checked it out. And I told my friends, and they checked it out. And their friends checked it out. And I doubt that that book ever spent a night on a cold library shelf. Now, when I think about it now, it seems to me that that book was more delicious because the librarian had cut the pages out of Lady Chatterley's Lover. And I'm inclined to think that in her own way, she contributed to broadening our educational horizons. 1965, Tom Lehrer, remember that was the week that was? He had a song called Smut, and a couple of lines I remember. Who needs a hobby? Like tennis or philately. I've got a hobby, rereading Lady Chatterley. I'm going to tell you now 2 stories about 2 different women who played a big part in my life. First one was named Bee-Gee. Bee-Gee got up every morning before anybody else, and she quickly put her sari on, she pulled her hair into a bun, she went to the kitchen. The kitchen was not like our kitchens. It was about an 8-foot square concrete floor, no windows, no cupboards, just a few shelves for pots and pans and cutlery and such. Had no stove, just a couple of burners on the floor, 1 gas, 1 charcoal. No refrigerator. They bought fruit and vegetables and meat, fresh every day. And she made bed tea because everybody in the family, all 11 people, they didn't like to eat breakfast until they'd had their baths. But before they took a bath, they'd like to have a cup of tea with milk and sugar. And so Bee-Gee made the tea. And then after that, she started breakfast, and breakfast was a pretty big affair. Omelet, toast, juice, more tea, and parathas, which are a kind of whole wheat flatbread, rolled and folded and re-rolled and shallow fried. And that took a while, 11 people. And then by about 10 o'clock in the morning, her husband, Pitaji, was apt to say something like, fruit in the morning is golden, fruit in the afternoon is silver, and fruit in the evening is brass. So Bee-Gee would cut up guavas and mango and papaya for fruit in the morning. And then it was time to start lunch, sitting on that low stool close to the floor. And lunch would be lentils and a couple of vegetables and some rice and some chapatis, which were like puffy whole wheat tortillas. And most of the men ate about 4, and most of the women ate about 2. And there'd be yogurt and pickles, she might take a little break in the early afternoon, or she might make pickles or something like that. And around 4 o'clock, afternoon tea with some sweets and something savory, and maybe her women friends would join her in the kitchen, and she was a tiny woman, like a little roly-poly woman. She had a big laugh. But laugh or not, she'd be getting the afternoon tea ready. And then it was time to start dinner. And dinner was a big affair. You know, 2 or 3 vegetables, lentils, rice, more chapatis, yogurt, pickles, and maybe a lamb curry or a chicken curry. And she wasn't quite done because around 10:30, people like to have hot milk with sugar before they went to bed. And she would get it ready for her. Now, I knew about all of this because Biji was my mother-in-law. You know, I had married a man from Punjab. And I was very nervous about it. I was 21, relatively clueless, you know, and quite nervous. Neither one of our families was happy that we were going to get married, this Canadian Protestant girl with this Indian Hindu man. My father-in-law, Pitaji, he wrote me a letter, and he suggested that I emulate his wife, Biji. He said she was a model of Indian wifehood. In particular, she was perfectly submissive, which actually wasn't on my list of qualities I was trying to. And I worried about all the usual things. You know, were they going to like me? Were they going to accept me? But we arrived in one hot June summer. And that first meal she served, you know, in the middle of the table there were all the things that I had mentioned, you know, lentils and vegetables and rice and chapatis, and she had made a special dish just for me, and she'd put it on a plate just for me. See, she had heard that Canadians don't like spicy food. And especially in those days, that was pretty much true. And she had heard that Canadians really like potatoes. And for the most part, that was true too. So she had made a big potato, boiled it, you know, peeled it, boiled it, no salt, no seasonings, plain, lukewarm, boiled potato sitting on my plate. And I looked at the potato and I looked at the food in the middle of the table, and I ate the potato. But then I ate enough of the other food so that she would get the idea. She didn't have to make all that special food just for me. Right? We were there about a month, and everything went well. And the day before we were going to leave to go back to New Delhi and catch the plane home, my sister-in-law, Shashi, she came to me and she said, Babiji. See, nobody ever called me Margaret. They always called me Babiji, which means respected older brother's wife. I kind of like it. When I see them, they still call me Babiji. You know, she says, Babiji, in India we have a custom that when a girl goes to her in-law's house, for the first 30 days, she isn't asked to do anything around the house, but after 30 days, she's asked to make dessert. And then she's like fully a part of the family. And Biji wants you to make dessert. And I thought to myself, how am I going to get out of this? I mean, I knew nothing about making Indian desserts. But I went to the kitchen, And there was Biji sitting on that low stool close to the ground. And she had a karai, which is like a wok. And in it she had Indian-style halva, which is made with cream of wheat and a whole lot of butter and a whole lot of sugar and nuts and raisins and cardamoms. And it is good. But it was done. But she motioned for me to take the spoon and stir it. So I stirred it once around, and ta-da! I had made dessert. So she got up and she hugged me. I think she cried a little bit, and she ran to her bedroom and she came back with a box, a gift box. And I opened it up, and inside was a silk sari, a rose pink silk sari, to commemorate the day I became truly part of the family. And it occurred to me that in her cooking and in her kind heart, Biji bridged a sea of cultural differences. Thank you. Now, the other woman was my mother. And that was a more complicated relationship, as they always are. When my mother was very young, a farm wife with a baby, my older brother, she went running out of the house one night. She ran across the potato field, across the road to her neighbor's house, and she said, Jenny, call everyone. Our house is on fire. And she left the baby with her friend, and she ran back trying to save something from the house, but she really couldn't. And she joined the line forming, the neighbors carrying buckets of water from the well to the burning house. But it was too late, and the house was burned to the ground. But my father and mother built another. They built it with their own two hands, board by board. But she didn't really get a chance to live in it because 1939 in Canada, it was war. And my father enlisted in the Canadian Army. And from that time on, until he retired, they never owned their own house again. They lived in PMQs, permanent married quarters. PMQs were exactly the same from one coast to the other. And the insides were painted only one of 4 colors. I only remember 2. I called them hospital green and throw up yellow. And my mother could only plant flowers like 18 inches from the foundation of the house, which was not enough. So she longed for a house, and when he retired, they decided they would stay in Edmonton, which was the last place he was posted to. And they bought a little 3-bedroom house, white stucco, 1-story, bright turquoise trim. And my father, he pushed dozens of wheelbarrows full of topsoil and manure to create the best lawn in the neighborhood. And he planted a blue spruce in the front yard and an apple tree in the backyard that was bred to survive Alberta winters. And my mother planted raspberries and pansies and petunias and nasturtiums and roses and geraniums and everything else she could think of. And she decided she was going to stay in that house until she died. And she almost did. But by the time she was a widow in 92, she was pretty frail. Her heart was failing, her kidneys were failing. She'd had knee replacements, hip replacements. She had osteoporosis. She was legally blind, and she had the beginnings of dementia. But she was still determined. She was going to stay in that house. She was going to live alone in the house she always had. There was no reason why she couldn't continue to do so. But one bitterly cold January day, where she went to take the garbage out the back, she always had done it. She always would do it. And she fell on the icy brick sidewalk, and she shattered her femur. And in the hospital, the orthopedist gave us a serious talk. He did not think it would ever heal. He could not operate. He said, with her osteoporosis, her bones are like butter. Nothing would hold. He said, even if it did heal, and that would be a big, big if, she would be too weak. He didn't expect she would ever walk again, and he didn't expect she could ever go home. And my mother said, she says, well, that's ridiculous, she said. People get broken legs all the time. Just put on a cast and let me go home. But it didn't work that way. Every day she wanted to go home. And her plan was to call a taxi and go home. So my brother and his wife and I took turns staying all day, staying all night, so she couldn't. I mean, she attempted it, but she couldn't succeed in getting out of bed, calling a taxi, going home. She got pretty mad at us. She disinherited us a number of times. Once she said to my brother, she said, brace yourself. You're about to hear language that you may not have heard before. My brother was delighted. He thought he's going to add to his vocabulary. So, damn. My brother was so disappointed. He says, I think I heard that one already. She had delusions. She says, Margaret, why are they keeping me in this dark, dank basement with all the rats? I says, Mom, you're in the Royal Alec. You're on the 4th floor. The sunshine is coming through the window. She said, I'm on a dirty old scow. And you know I hate boats. She said, you see all the people scowling at me? Well, it really didn't heal. And she went through a succession of splints and braces and casts that went from her hips all the way to her toes, and it was uncomfortable and unmanageable. And eventually she had to go to a nursing home, and we found a good one. And we brought in a flat screen TV and some flowering plants and her favorite red comforter, and she kind of ignored them all. And every day she would say to me, because I spent days there and my brother spent evenings, every day she would say, Margaret, just take me home. And every evening when I went back to her house where I was staying, I started taking her house apart. I started with the food. I threw away the jam in the refrigerator with the mold on top, and the dried out casseroles and the stale lemon cookies that she liked. My sister came from the farm where she lives, about 100 miles away. And we emptied out the giant chest freezer with her many years old frozen raspberries and frozen applesauce and freezer burn hamburger. And she had a pantry. And the stuff in the pantry, well, it had been there for a very long time. I mean, the labels were from a grocery store that had gone out of business about 15 years before. So I, being, I'm a very environmentally minded human being. So I emptied everything and recycled the containers. And one time I was emptying a big can of pureed pumpkin. And it exploded. I mean, it went up my face, onto the window, onto the cupboards, through the space between the cupboards and onto the drapes. But I rinsed it out and I threw it in the can. And the next morning I went back and my mother said, "Margaret, just take me home. I'll be okay. Just take me home." And I started making piles of tablecloths, piles of towels, piles of cutlery and pots and pans, Christmas decorations, garden supplies, because I knew she wasn't coming home. And I knew the day would come when we had to decide what we wanted to keep and have a garage sale and sell the rest and then sell the house. And I would have to get home to my husband and back to Saratoga. So she got sicker. She started to fade. I used to say, if my mother found out what I do every evening, my life wouldn't be worth a plug nickel. See, my mother could be a scary person. And I knew that if my mother found out what I was doing, it would break her heart. Well, she started to fail. And we all knew that it wasn't going to be long. And she began 2 or 3 days before she died. She knew it too. And she started talking about a house that wasn't our house. It was a 2-story, not a 1-story. And I didn't remember that house. And I wondered if it was the house that burned down, all those years ago. And she made a few suggestions that involved the house. Well, first of all, she said, little sandwiches, cookies, coffee, tea. And I knew what she was referring to. And then she said, be sure the beds are made. And the next day she died. Well, we sold a house to a young family, and they cut down that blue spruce in the front. And it was a good thing, because that blue spruce had to be 75 feet tall. It totally blocked the entire front of the house. She wouldn't let us trim it because she had it full of bird feeders. But once they cut it down, sunlight could come in the house again. And I like to think, they had children, I like to think that those children were playing on the apple tree in the backyard. And I hope they enjoy all the flowers that were still blooming at my mother's house, even after she died. I think I liked that life had come back to the house. I think my mother would like that too. Thank you. And somewhere, Christie Keegan, the birthday girl, is here. Yes. Why? I know. Why not? A wonderful teller.
I know Joe is going to insist on changing the mic, and so I'm going to wait for him, and here he is. Yes, in fact, it is my birthday. It is my 71st birthday today. I'm officially in my 70s. Which should then be said right here. But you know, I have to say, when you wake up and you're suddenly in your 70s, it causes you to think a great deal about the choices that you've made in life. Many of mine have been good. Some of them have turned out well. Many of them you have heard about from the stage at different times. But my set is going to be one long story that's a series of stories woven together about a choice that I made. So imagine it is an early spring Saturday morning, and I am working my way through a large coffee, a bagel, and the Boston Globe. It's the late 1980s. And by the time I'm done with the coffee and the bagel, I am almost done with the want ads. Now, I wasn't looking for a job. I had a job I liked a great deal, but you never know what you'll find in the want ads. And so, on the very last page, in the first column, 2/3 of the way down, I can still see it in my mind's eye, a little tiny 2-line ad. Volunteers wanted, and a phone number. Franklin Park Zoo. This was not entirely outside my wheelhouse. 6 or 7 years before then, I had done animal care as a volunteer at the Boston Aquarium. I had been one of those people in a wetsuit, in the penguin pool, gently slipping fish to those really fast-moving penguins that often whoop right through your legs. And I'd been one of those people in a wetsuit who had climbed up onto the perches where the penguins sat and scrubbed them so the guano was gone so they wouldn't get bumblefoot. I'll explain that to you if you want. I was also the person 3 days a week who did the noon show with Lartu and Antigua, the resident river otters who live there. And that mostly involved emptying their pool, cleaning their pool, feeding them fish, head for the female, body for the male, and then blowing bubbles. And I had loved it. I thought possibly the combination of that experience would get me an interview at the zoo, and it did. And so about a week later, I met with the director of education and the director of volunteers, because the position they were looking to fill wasn't in animal care. It was in educating visitors to the zoo, not only about the animals who live there, but also about the zoo's greater mission. And I would tell you that half an hour into this interview, I wanted to work with these two women worse than anything. They were bright and engaging and committed and dedicated, not just to the health and welfare of the animals in their care, but also to animals in the wild. And issues of preservation and conservation were consummate for them. I was like one of those little kids, you know, at a game like, pick me, please, pick me, pick me, pick me. And they did. And so about a month later, myself and about a dozen other people met at 8 o'clock on a Saturday morning in a small classroom at the rear of the Children's Zoo at the Franklin Park Zoo. It was a little bit daunting when I learned what it was we were going to do. First, we were given a 2-inch thick loose-leaf binder with information about every single animal at the zoo, which we were expected to assimilate over the next 6 months. Now, the way we would do that is we were told to pick 1 or 2 animals that we liked, learn as much as we could, and figure out the best way for us to share that information with the public. And we would go home and do that. We would come back the following Saturday morning at 8 in the morning, and we would practice on each other. And we were there from 8 in the morning till noon. And we also had an opportunity to talk to zookeepers who worked in various places in the zoo, and the curators who designed the exhibits and oversaw the animals, and sometimes even the vet. At the end of 4 hours of bookwork, as I called it, we had lunch. And then for another 4 hours, we would go out into the zoo in pairs. And we would shadow docents, more seasoned docents, and zookeepers and curators, and see how they interacted with the public. Over that 6-month period, there were lots of tests. The final exam was we had to go out in public and be shadowed by those other docents and zookeepers and curators, be judged about whether or not we were engaging enough, whether or not we were knowledgeable enough. I will tell you, my GMATs had nothing on this. I was a wreck. But I passed. And so I was let loose in the zoo. Now, I have to tell you, I didn't just come on Saturdays. I also often came back on Sundays in the afternoon. I know there are people in this room who hate zoos. I'm sure there are people in this room who disapprove of zoos who probably haven't been in a zoo in 40 years. But for me, a kid who grew up in New York City, who went to the Central Park Zoo all the time we lived in Midtown, and who spent, I would say, 1 out of 2 weekends, fall, winter, and spring, with my father's family in the South Bronx at the Bronx Zoo, this was an unbelievable gift. I got to go to the zoo for nothing, anytime I wanted. And so they let me loose, and there they were, the public. Now, I have to say, most of the time, things went really, really well. There were a couple hitches, the technology hitch, like there was no internet in the late 80s. Or even the early 90s. So if someone asked me a mysterious question and I didn't know the answer, I had to confess that I didn't know the answer. I couldn't pull out my phone and look up the answer. I would have to take down their question, their name, their phone number, and when they were gone, go and find someone who might know, and that could mean a zookeeper or a curator or the vet or possibly another docent, and sometimes a visit to the library before I'd get back to them a week later. But those questions made me smarter. And then there was the biting. I would say the first time I got bitten, I was surprised. Now, I had been bitten before. I was bitten certainly at the aquarium. I will tell you that there were a couple of very testy, very pesky nesting penguins who did not like my hands going in to check for eggs and were happy to take big pieces out of them. But I wasn't expecting it from the very sweet Mediterranean donkey in the children's zoo. She was about this tall, and with her ears about this tall. And she loved when I curried her, and she loved when I combed her very thick mane, kind of mohawkish. But one day, for no reason that I could determine because she didn't bother to share, she simply turned her head towards me, opened up her mouth, and with those giant chiclet teeth, right on my left knee. No. By the time she let go, I sort of hobbled to the vets, which is where you go. If you get hurt at the zoo, you don't go to a doctor, you go to a vet. And they packed me with ice, and I was fine. Now, the second time I got bit in the butt by a pig. Now, the pig had been a piglet when a member of the BSO, the Boston Symphony Orchestra, had bought a baby piglet thinking it would be the perfect apartment animal. Look at my face when I say that. The perfect apartment animal. But the piglet did what piglets do. It ate and it grew, and it ate and it grew, and it ate and it grew. It was not a miniature pig. It was a very large pig. And by the time they realized it had outgrown their kitchen, it was too late. It wreaked havoc on their apartment, and their solution was to chain the poor thing to the radiator. And it was a very unhappy pig. And by the time they thought to donate it to the zoo, it was a downright cranky pig. We realized we couldn't visit this on the public, and so we decided we would collectively socialize it. And so 2 of us at a time, because none of us trusted her enough to take her, with just one of us, we'd put a halter on her, and we'd walk her around our offices. Or we'd walk her behind the scenes. We'd walk her over to the vet hospital. Any place where we thought we could introduce her to somebody who might understand that she had a somewhat unusual personality. And as long as you were walking next to her, she was just fine, and she was really quite pretty, and she would kind of clip, clap, clip along. But if you turned your back, she would nail you in the butt every single time. Everybody in the education department took to wearing their sweatshirts tied around their hips at all times if she was out of her enclosure. The third time I got bitten was by the donkey again. The fourth time I got bitten was by the donkey again. The fifth time I got bitten was by the pig again. The sixth time I got bitten, however, was someone new. The zoo used to host birthday parties for kids. And so we would use some of the education animals. And I'm sitting on the floor, and I'm surrounded by a group of kids who are very, very rowdy because they've gotten their cake before anything. Who thought of that? And this poor little rabbit, this beautiful lop-eared rabbit, these gorgeous long ears, nestled in my lap. And before I realized it, she had eaten a hole through my sweatshirt and my T-shirt and was working her way through my belly to get out the back. Ooh, gotta go, kids. Mm-hmm. I got bitten again. I walked into the aviary in the office. It was winter. I had a heavy coat on, thank heaven. And as I walked in, there was a cockatoo on a perch who I'd seen many times before. I often ate lunch in the aviary. They had a number of birds in there who were often recovering from something. And this bird had been donated to the zoo. It had had a wonderful owner who had loved it tremendously. But exotic birds, especially large parrots, are 2-year-olds for life. They are. They expect an enormous amount of attention, an enormous amount of love. And when that person died, their family had no idea what to do with this bird, who then plucked herself completely naked. There was no way the feathers would go back. She was so sad looking. She had this gorgeous plume up top, and then whoops, nothing below there. And even though we had been friends, I thought I often shared my fruit with her for whatever reason. Maybe she didn't like my taste in clothing. She did not. Nailed me right here. Big piece out of the jacket, big piece out of the sweatshirt. Really, I had replaced those uniforms a lot. Small piece out of the T-shirt and a really big bruise on my bicep. But the biting notwithstanding, when Michael, the curator, really, because, a lesser woman might be deterred. Michael, the curator, or the zookeeper rather, of the Children's Zoo suggested that I go on and take an advanced course to get certification as an exotic animal handler. I jumped at the chance, even with the biting. Because the truth was, I was already doing animal care at the Children's Zoo. The state of Massachusetts had privatized the zoo. Basically, that means they had crossed them off almost every budget line. There was a hiring freeze, so there were nowhere near enough staff to work with the animals, and we had actually taken to begging some vendors for food. So I was already doing many of the things I would be doing if I got certified. And so for another 6 months, I learned everything I could about how to handle many of the zoos. Not the big cats, not that kind of thing, but any animal I might have to use in a program, because once I was certified as an animal handler, I could take animals out of their respective enclosures and out into public. The most important thing for us was that the animals stay safe. We didn't wear earrings or rings or any jewelry at all so as not to cut, or scratch the animal inadvertently. We had to learn how to very safely get them out of their enclosure, whatever that was, and into some transport, whatever that was. And then when we got to the venue, which was often at the African Tropical Forest or the Children's Zoo, but could be at the Boston Flower Show or Plymouth Plantation, you never knew, you had to take them out safely. You also had to keep the public safe from the animal in the same way you kept the animal safe from the public. This while you're talking about the animal, answering questions, and trying to have eyes in the back of your head. Anybody who thinks that a docent in an art museum has a hard time, no. Anybody who handles live animals really deserves a gold medal in multitasking. So I went through my 6 months, and I got my certification as an exotic animal handler. And I was off and running. And it was wonderful. It's actually really heady stuff. To have an animal in your arms or on your lap or next to you that you're interacting with, and it made such a difference for people in the audience. And then there was the biting. Now, the problem often with audiences is that the other wild animal may be in them, children. And the other wild animal is not anywhere near as predictable as somebody that you work with all the time. So there was Jake the snake. Jake the snake was a 6.5-foot long boa constrictor, about this big around at his widest. I'm partial to snakes. I love them. Now, the way that you move a large snake, should you ever need to know this, is you urge them out of their enclosure very gently, tilting it up into a pillowcase, and they'll kind of slip in there and settle on the bottom. And then you tie the pillowcase and you lift it up from the bottom and you put them into a carrier that has air holes and you latch the top. You lift up the carrier and you put it on a cart and you're on your way. When you get there, you have to pour him out of that container. Well, Jake weighed a fair amount, and I was much smaller then. And so the only way I could really handle him was if I was sitting on a table. And my partner, Tom, we worked in pairs, and Tom, who's Tall Tom, we called him, he was about 6'4" and about 240. And Tall Tom had tracked tigers in Thailand for 2 years, which I liked saying to people when I introduced him because it was such an unbelievable CB. Oh, this is Tall Tom. He tracked tigers in Thailand for 2 years. But I knew somebody his size would always have my back, and sometimes my front should I need it. And so I would sit on the table, and Tom would take the top off the container and take out the pillowcase, and we would undo it, and Jake would slip out onto my lap, and he would usually kind of coil himself around with just gentle guidance around me. And so the bulk of his weight was on my lap, and a little bit of his tail was on the table, and his lovely head was weaving in and out. Now, I would hold him where his neck would be if he had one, but not tightly because he wanted to move. Now, the thing about snakes is if they're in shed, snakes shed. If they're in shed, the skin will cover their eyes, which makes them very vulnerable and therefore very cranky. So we were really careful to log that on a calendar and then to watch him and make sure that he was nowhere near shed when we took him out. He was 5, 6, 7 days past shed when this story took place. He looked fine. His skin looked great. We also were really careful to wash, kind of surgeon-like, not just the hands, sing happy birthday 3 times. You know this from the last year and a half, don't you? Everybody do it with me. No, I'm only kidding. Really, do you have skin left? I don't. All the way to here. On the off chance that something that could be a predator might consider me a snack. So I realized that Jake is a little bit more restless than he normally is, but I think maybe there's just something in the environment he's not used to. His head is weaving back and forth. And all of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, I sense a disturbance. Now, one of the things I really love about snakes, especially big ones, is they have this amazing musculature all the way down the front of them, and really, really almost soft scales. They're not slimy, they're really dry and kind of cool to the touch. But with a big snake, you don't even have to touch them. You kind of hold them here and you just barely move the air in front of their bellies, and you can see them undulate all the way down, which gives you an opportunity to tell kids, and this is how they move over obstacles, over rocks, and over tree limbs. It's an amazing thing to look at. Well, I'm about halfway down Jake when the disturbance becomes clear. There is a young boy running towards me, both hands out. It is very clear that he wants to grab Jake. I am very clear that this is not a good idea for anybody, including me and Jake. And so I put out my left foot and my left hand just enough to jar Jake and kind of frighten him as I put my hand in front of the boy to keep him from hurting Jake. Jake decides, something's going on. What? Uh-oh. Now, boas don't have fangs, and they don't have toxin, and I wasn't worried I was going to die, but I got to tell you, it really hurts. They have a bony plate that kind of drops down and holds their prey. holds it really tightly. At the same time, while he's trying to figure out if I'm a size to eat, he starts to tighten just a little bit because that's how boas hang on, just in case their prey is going to get away. At this point, blessedly, tall Tom appears, and I can feel him putting his hands between Jake and me at the back and gently loosening him. And I am holding completely still so he does not think that I'm a struggling mouse. And eventually, he lets go. My hand was black and blue for weeks. It was almost non-functional for a couple of months. Yeah, biting. And yet he remained one of my favorite animals. But not my most favorite animal. My most favorite animal in the entire zoo was Awesome the possum. I loved her. I love possums anyway. For those of you who don't know, their temperature is too low for them to carry rabies. They eat lots and lots of ticks. And that thing that they do when they fall over is not playing possum. They actually go into a coma. So should it happen in your yard, which had happened to me not that long ago, keep them warm and sit there in a chair until they wake up enough to stagger off so some predator doesn't eat them. Please. So I loved Awesome. The other thing about possums is they have this unusual aging process. It's not really progeria, that sort of advanced aging. But even though they're the size of a house cat, they weigh about 7 pounds, a small, very small house cat. Mine was way bigger. They age so quickly that by the time they're 3 or 4, their bones are brittle. And so handling them as an educational animal is somewhat of a challenge. By the time I was certified and Awesome and I got to be friends, she was about 3.5 or 4, and she had bitten every single person who had gotten near her. I was not to be deterred. I tried every food I could think of, and eventually it was clear that Awesome loved grapes. And so I would arrive on the day of a presentation with a bag of grapes, and I would peel them so she could smell them. And I would hold them toward the front of the enclosure, and I would coax her out. And I would give her one. And then I'd hold another one, and I would hold it close to me. And she would get closer, and I'd give her another one. And then I would hold it up and up and up. And one day, after weeks of doing this and having her scurry back into her enclosure, she stood up on her hind legs. And with her little tiny paws that looked like hands, she grasped the front of my T-shirt. And her little tiny feet moved forward and perched on the top of my jeans. And that amazing prehensile tail, that naked, strange-looking thing that acts like a fifth appendage, she wrapped around my right leg. I just kept giving her grapes. And then I put my hands underneath her and started to sway back and forth, like a mother possum would when they carry their babies, or a tree in a gentle wind, because possums are, by and large, arboreal. And then every once in a while, if my arms got tired, I would zip up my sweatshirt and kind of hold her with just her head sticking out. And in that way, I was able to kind of walk around the children's zoo and introduce people to her. Well, one day I'm swaying back and forth, and I'm talking about how exquisitely, incredibly delicate her tail is, and how tactile it is, and how it can sense things, and that I never touch it because it would bother her. And out of the corner of my eye, I see a small boy running towards him. Really, the other wild animals are just not sufficiently tethered to their minders, is all I could say. And as he runs towards me, I can tell he's got one hand out, and he is absolutely determined to get her tail, and I think that's a bad idea. And I shift enough, and I have my hand out, and Awesome decides to do what arboreal animals do. She decides to climb up me. She stops just long enough to sink some, but not all, of her 50 teeth into my collarbone, chewing just a little bit. Not a real bite, just kind of registering her disapproval of this entire thing. And then, whoop, right up to the top of my head, where she hangs on with all 4 feet, her tail kind of... At this point, the young boy's mother is screaming at him. This is a mammal. She has very good hearing. She's getting really perturbed at the screaming woman, and Tom is trying to take the screaming woman and her child away from me so I can calm the animal on my head, who suddenly decides she has definitely had enough, and she pees and poops right on me. As it drips down the side of my face and into the open wound on my collarbone, I think to myself, I'm going to die. I'm going to die, and this is an unpaid position. But what I said, because my training was so good, children, this is why you don't play with wild animals in your backyard. Eventually, Tom got her off me with a fair amount of hissing back in her enclosure, and I went to the vet, where they washed me up and sent me on my way. I have to say, even with that, it was the single most rewarding 5 years I've ever spent in my life. Now, those were the mishaps that happened kind of, because of humans. There were some other mishaps. We had an exhibit once at the Boston Flower Show, which, if you've never been, is absolutely gorgeous, and in this huge building. And between the curators and the zookeepers and the volunteers and the horticulture department, we had built a desertscape. And so on one side of the desertscape was a southwest desert, and it had a Gila monster in an enclosure, and a tarantula in an enclosure, and a scorpion. And then on this side was an African desert landscape. And the kind of main player on that was an African tortoise, a giant African tortoise, a 65-pound hassock with movable legs. We had 6 of them who'd been rescued at the airport by the customs folks who found them in a smuggler's underbelly of a plane. And they all had holes drilled in them. This is what happens in Africa. You find a tortoise which cannot run very quick, and you drill a hole in, and you tie it to a tree. And if the tortoise is incredibly lucky, it does not starve to death. It has enough food to eat before somebody comes back to get it, to ship it to the United States to sell it for more money, which is nuts. So we couldn't return it to Africa, one, because it already had a hole and there was no point doing that. And so 6 of them came to live at the zoo. I love them. And because they get stressed differently than Gila monsters and scorpions and tarantulas, who had really no interaction with the public, we changed them out pretty often. We were about 20 minutes from the venue, and so we would change the animals out about every 2 or 2.5 hours. It was the end of the day. I was tired, Tom was tired, Henry, the tortoise in residence, had it. Now, we had put a fence to keep the public back so they could just see the animals. Tom went to get the van and bring it into the venue to pick up all the animals. Henry was not interested in waiting for Tom to bring the van. He walked forward in this wonderful, lumbering, low-to-the-ground way that he had, and simply pushed the fence down. I ran forward and put my fingers around his carapace, thinking surely someone who weighs twice what he did could stop him. Wrong. So as I started to fall forward, I realized I was going to have to hurry up just a little bit. And as I hurried up, I did the only thing I could think of to do. I sat down on the ground and wrapped my legs around the rest of his carapace. And Henry kept walking. I had a young docent with me who I immediately deputized, do not leave those animals for anything. I could see Tom quite a way down the venue coming towards me. And there I was, to rousing applause, dusting the center of the floor as Henry walked towards the van. We got Henry back safe. He was fine. He was incredibly happy once in the van to get his half head of lettuce, and we got him home. He was not invited out for a number of days. Then there are adult humans. Yeah, they're adult humans. So I was very fond of eating lunch with the peahens. There are peacocks and peahens. at the zoo, and there were a lot of them. And I would often sit on this bench at the end of the aviary, and they were just roaming loose. I mean, there's kind of wandering around the zoo. And I would sit on a bench, and the peahens would often sit on this part of the bench, and I would bring some of their food with me and kind of sprinkle it around, and they just kind of sit with me. And so one day I finished my lunch, and I folded up my paper, and I put it in my back pocket, and I was about to leave when I realized that one of the peacocks, one of the males, was very interested in one of the peahens. Ooh, he was doing his best to get her attention. He was dragging that tail, and dragging that tail, and dragging that tail, and she was thinking maybe he was kind of cute. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen a peacock lift their tail. There's no mechanization there. There's no switch. This is a huge expenditure of effort. It is muscle. And if you get to watch them do it, it's an amazing thing. You can hear the kind of rustle of all of those beautiful feathers, kind of as all of the muscles in the back of this bird clench to bring up those feathers and fan it out. So here's this peahen who's being courted, and this male who's just, he's all about getting busy, he hopes. Oh, Lord, yes. And his tail is coming up, and it's coming up, and I look, and I realize that there's a young couple, a sweet couple in love, standing over there, and they don't see me. And then I see the young man go, wait a minute. And there he is. He's creeping up behind the peacock. His hand is out. He's going to, talk about interrupt us. He is about to avail himself of a feather for his girlfriend. Oh, I don't think so, not on my watch. I sneak up behind him. Just as quietly, shh, I say to the girl. And just as his hand reaches out, just as the peacock is in full display and completely unaware of the drama unfolding behind him, I tap him on the shoulder. He turns and looks at me. How would you feel if I did that to you when you were doing that to her? Dawning realization in his eyes that humans are not the only creatures on the planet. As he slinks off. You can get them for $1 in the gift shop. We get them when they molt. Well, my very favorite, this is my last story, my very, very, very favorite story. I call this one, now I'll tell you what I call it when it's over. So there were certainly times in bad weather when there wasn't a whole lot going on in the zoo. And I in general, was either in the African tropical forest in the Hippo Theater, where I started my career as storyteller in residence there, or I was in the children's zoo. But I frequently went from place to place, from Hoofdstock to the aviary. But when there was nothing going on and wherever I was assigned, I loved to go to the African tropical forest to the gorilla exhibit. My friend Lynn had been a docent for a number of years before I started, and there was nothing she did not know about gorillas. The only person who probably knew more was Dave Linehan, the zookeeper, who had worked there for decades, and who people from all over the world came to talk to about gorillas. Other zoos and other wildlife rehabs looked to Dave for advice about how to best deal with gorillas, and these were lowland gorillas. And we had a full troop. We had a silverback and some younger males, and we had females and young. And Lynn would sit in front of their enclosure. There was, as soon as you came into the African tropical forest, this enormous, very, very thick, very reinforced piece of plexiglass. And you could see one part of the enclosure. And in general, who you saw mostly was females and young there. And Lynn would offer to introduce you to the gorillas. And if you were a child, she would have you sit down and kind of not ever, ever, do not ever look a gorilla in the eye. It's rude. You slide your eyes and look away. You slide your eyes, and they will do the same. Like that. And eventually, everybody gets comfy. And then Lynn would sometimes have kids, or even grown-ups, sit next to that plexiglass, shoulder to shoulder, and it was not unusual for the females to come over and match hands. They really liked little kids. And any time a female saw a pregnant woman, Lynn would say to the pregnant woman, would you mind just kind of standing in profile? And inevitably, as she turned, the females would put their hands up. There was also signage that made it very clear the appropriate way to meet a gorilla. Never mind the do not harass or annoy or intimidate or threaten. This is how you do it. And Lynn was very clear, and she was wonderful with people. She would have entire groups of people averting their eyes, looking down, looking up, looking down, looking up. And 99 and 9/10% of the time, people were incredibly respectful and in awe that they were looking at something that so clearly was related to them. There's always one. You all have one. There's one in your family, or one in your job, or one in your neighborhood. There's always one. And so on this kind of rainy day, I had gone down to sit with Lynn. There was nothing else going on, and I was sitting on the ground, and she was sitting on a chair, and we were talking, and a man walks in. He glares at the female gorilla. So Lynn stands up and she says, you know what, if you'd like to read the sign, but you know, this is the appropriate way to do this, and we ask that you be that this is their home, and we ask that you act in a way that is not intimidating for them. Oh, lady, come on, lighten up. Lynn said, no, really, honestly, I've been here a long time, and I know that this is the best way to see them. And if you're respectful, you'll get to see a lot of their activity. You'll get to see them, you know, using their enrichment things and eating and so forth. Lady! At the top of his lungs, at which point the silverback comes running from around the corner and flies at that plexiglass all 4 feet, bounce off it. It reverberates, scares the bejesus out of me and Lynn, and probably the guy a little bit too, and then stands there sort of pant-hooting because he's been intimidated. The females and the young scurry back kind of out of sight around the corner, and Lynn says, you cannot do that. You're going to have to leave, and she points to the door, and she calls security on her walkie-talkie because that's how long ago this was. He goes, and he walks further into the building. Now, down the hallway and around the corner was an open overlook. And from there, you could see a lot of the enclosure, and you could see a lot of activity. And so Lynn calls security again. He says, listen, he's not leaving. He's going further into the building. I need you to remove him. And we follow him. He gets to the middle of the enclosure. He looks down. At this point, the silverback has realized where he's gone, and he's there, and he's got the rest of his troop behind him, and he's gesticulating, and he's pant-hooting, and he's really upset. And there's nothing he can do. And I feel just as helpless, and I can imagine if I feel as helpless as I did, what he must feel like. And the guy does it again. At which point the gorilla is jumping up and down. There's no way for him to get over the moat or up this wall. We've had, mountaineers try it, but he wants to. And there's no rocks, there's nothing they can throw because we know better, right? The guy does it a couple more times, and Lynn is absolutely begging him, please stop, you've got to stop. And then all of a sudden she goes, step back, to me. Doesn't say it to him. And we kind of go back. We can still see the gorilla, and we can see the guy. And the gorilla gets really quiet, really, really quiet. And he looks at the guy. You know how big gorilla hands are? They're really big. And with aim that would make a Major League Baseball player happy, wham! Gets him right in the face just as he executes another eyes, nose, mouth, ears, shirt. I would like to say that I was so well trained that I was an empathetic docent who offered him paper towels. But I didn't. I laughed myself silly, as did Lynn, as did the security guys who happened to arrive at just that moment and escorted him out of the building. The name of that story is Gorillas 1, Humans 0. I also have to say it is so much fun to tell to people. This is absolutely we've been Zooming for the last year and a half, and I have seen many of your wonderful, beautiful, marvelous faces on Zoom, but I got to tell you, having you here in person is just the best. Thank you so much, and I want to give a hand to both Jeannine and Margaret, who I was listening to on a speaker in the green room. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Caffe Lena, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming. Oh.
Happy birthday. Please remember the wait.
Oh, please remember the wait staff. This is hard work to be here and volunteer work, so please remember the wait staff. Thank you. I've lost. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Christie. Happy birthday to you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I can't think of a better way to celebrate my birthday. Thank you.